The day her father took the money, 16-year-old Eliza understood something that would stay with her for the rest of her life. Sometimes the people meant to protect you are the first to break you. Before we begin, if stories about courage, second chances, and finding strength where no one expects it move you, take a moment to like this video and subscribe to the channel. And stay until the very end, because the last thing Eliza discovers changes everything. Rain tapped against the cracked kitchen window that evening, soft at first, then hard enough to rattle the glass. Eliza sat at the corner of the table with her hands folded tightly in her lap, trying to make herself smaller. She had spent most of her life trying to disappear. At 16, she was larger than the other girls in town. Heavy in body, quiet in voice, and awkward in every room she entered. In school they called her names that followed her down hallways and crawled under her skin long after the bell rang. At home it was worse, because home was where words had nowhere to hide. Her father, Martin Hale, had not always been a cruel man. At least that was what her mother used to say. Before sickness took her when Eliza was 11, she would sit beside her daughter at night, brushing hair from her face, whispering that gentleness was not weakness. But after her mother died, Martin changed. Or maybe grief only uncovered what had always been there. The drinking started first, then the debts, then the sharpness in his eyes every time he looked at Eliza, as though her existence itself reminded him of everything he had lost. "You eat too much," he would mutter when she reached for bread. "You take up too much room. You'll never be anything but a burden." At first she cried, then she learned not to. Tears only seemed to make him angrier. That night there was another man in the kitchen. Eliza had never seen him before. He was older, perhaps 50, maybe more, with broad shoulders bent slightly by years of work. His hands were rough, his face lined deeply by sun and weather. He wore a dark hat in his lap and said almost nothing. He simply watched the floor while Martin poured whiskey into 2 cloudy glasses. "This is her," Martin said, as if introducing livestock. The stranger lifted his eyes. They were gray, steady, and strangely sad. Eliza felt ice spread through her chest. "What do you mean?" she whispered. Martin ignored her. "You said you needed help at the ranch. She can cook enough not to starve. Strong enough too, more than looks would suggest." The man didn't answer right away. He reached into his coat and placed an envelope on the table. Martin grabbed it immediately. Eliza stared at the money, then at her father. Her voice came out thin and trembling. "What is this?" He finally looked at her. "It means you're going with him." For a moment the room disappeared. The rain vanished. Even the air seemed to stop. Eliza felt herself floating outside her body, staring at the scene as if it belonged to someone else. "You can't," she whispered. "I already did. I'm your daughter." Martin's jaw tightened. Not tonight. She thought that would be the moment she would scream or beg or run. Instead she sat very still. Because something inside her had broken so many times that it no longer knew how to shatter. The man stood. "We should go." Eliza looked at him with hatred so fierce it surprised her. "What are you going to do with me?" His expression did not change. "My name is Samuel Grady. And no one is going to hurt you." She wanted to spit at him. But 20 minutes later she was sitting in the passenger seat of an old truck, driving away from the only home she had ever known. The road stretched into darkness. Fields rolled past in shadow. Samuel said almost nothing. Eliza kept waiting for him to explain, to make demands, to reveal whatever terrible reason he had paid money for a frightened girl no one wanted. He only drove. After nearly 2 hours, they turned onto a narrow dirt road. At the end of it stood a ranch house under the pale moon. It was smaller than she expected. A barn sat off to one side. A windmill creaked in the distance. Samuel killed the engine. "You'll sleep inside," he said quietly. "There's stew on the stove if you're hungry." Eliza laughed bitterly. "Why? So you can fatten me up." He looked at her for a long moment. Not angry, not wounded, just tired. "You don't have to trust me tonight. But eat if you want." Then he walked away toward the barn. That confused her more than anything. Inside, the house smelled of cedar and old books. Not whiskey, not smoke. She stood by the door, waiting for fear to rise again, but instead there was only uncertainty. The stew was warm. Her stomach growled so hard it embarrassed her, even though no one was there to hear. She ate. Then she cried into the empty bowl. The first weeks at the ranch were harder than she could have imagined. Not because Samuel was cruel. Because he wasn't. He gave her a room with quilts folded neatly at the foot of the bed. He left money for new clothes. He never entered without knocking. He asked her to help with chores but never barked orders. And that frightened her more than anger would have. Kindness felt dangerous, like a trap she didn't understand. She woke every morning expecting the mask to fall. It didn't. Still, she kept her distance. The work was exhausting. Feeding chickens, carrying water, gathering eggs, scrubbing pans. Her body ached every night. She had never done so much. At first she resented every task. But slowly, something strange began to happen. She slept better. She breathed deeper. Her legs felt stronger. One morning she dropped a bucket while carrying water from the pump. It splashed across her dress. "I'm sorry," she blurted, panic rising instantly. Samuel looked over from the fence he was repairing. "For what?" "I spilled it." "So?" She blinked. He shrugged. "Water belongs to the earth. Get another bucket." And then he went back to work. It was such a small moment. Yet Eliza stood there stunned. In her old life, accidents had consequences. Here, mistakes simply happened. Weeks turned into months. Autumn laid gold across the hills. Eliza learned the names of horses. Learned how to mend torn feed sacks. Learned how to read weather in the clouds. Samuel spoke little, but when he did it mattered. He never wasted words. One afternoon she found him sitting on the porch steps holding a photograph. A little girl stared back from the picture, perhaps 9 years old, with dark curls and bright eyes. "Who is she?" Eliza asked. He was silent so long she thought he would not answer. "My daughter." The words landed softly between them. "What happened?" "She died." Eliza sat beside him. "When?" 8 years ago." He swallowed hard. "She was 16 when fever took her sister. 9 when she went." Something tightened in Eliza's chest. "You had 2 daughters." He nodded. "And your wife?" "Gone too." He looked out toward the field. "For a while I stopped speaking to God." She didn't know what to say. Then Samuel turned to her. "When I saw you in that kitchen, I recognized your eyes." She stared at him. "My oldest looked like that near the end. Like someone had convinced her she was worth less than the space she occupied." Eliza felt tears gather before she could stop them. "You didn't buy me." "No." "Then why did you give him money?" "Because men like your father only understand losing what they think they own." She could not breathe. "I paid his debt to make sure he could never come for you." The world shifted. For months she had lived with fear wrapped tight around her heart. And suddenly, for the first time since her mother died, that knot loosened. That night she cried until dawn. Not from pain, from relief. Winter arrived hard. Snow buried the fields. The work grew harsher, but Eliza grew stronger with it. Her body changed. Not into someone else, but into itself. Her face brightened. Her steps became steady. She laughed sometimes now. Quietly at first, then without apology. She started reading again too. Samuel had shelves of old novels, history books, poetry. Her mother had loved stories. For years Eliza had forgotten that part of herself. One evening Samuel found her asleep with a book open across her chest. He covered her with a blanket and turned down the lamp. That simple tenderness nearly undid her. But peace never arrives without testing. In early spring Martin came back. Eliza was feeding the horses when she heard the truck. Her blood went cold. He climbed down looking thinner, meaner, more desperate. "You're coming home," he said. She backed away. "No." His face darkened. "I said now." Samuel stepped out of the barn. "She stays." Martin sneered. "You think a handful of money makes her yours." "No," Samuel said evenly. "It means you no longer get to decide what happens to her." Martin lunged. Samuel caught his arm, but Martin was drunk and wild. In the struggle Eliza froze, 16 again, small again, terrified again. Then something inside her rose. "No." Her own voice shocked her. Both men stopped. She stepped forward, trembling but upright. "You don't get to touch me." Martin stared. "You're my daughter." "No," she said, tears burning. "I was." "You sold that." The silence that followed felt enormous. For the first time in her life, she saw something new in his eyes. Not anger. Cowardice. He looked away first. Then he left. When the truck disappeared down the road, Eliza collapsed into sobs. Samuel held her while she cried. And afterward, she stood a little taller. The years that followed were not perfect. Healing never is. There were still days when old words returned. Days when mirrors felt cruel. Days when fear whispered that kindness could vanish. But now there was work. There was purpose. There was someone who looked at her and saw more than survival. At 19 she began helping at the school in town. At first only reading to younger children. Then tutoring. Then staying later to help girls who had learned silence the way she once had. They listened to her because she did not pretend life was easy. She only proved it could change. One spring afternoon a little girl named Nora stayed after class. "Miss Eliza," she said quietly, "do you ever feel ugly?" Eliza knelt beside her. "Yes." Nora looked surprised. "What do you do?" Eliza smiled sadly. "I remember ugly is what pain says when it wants to stay." The child thought about that. Then hugged her. That night Eliza cried again. Because sometimes healing arrives disguised as being able to give someone else the words you once needed. Years later, when Samuel's hands had grown too stiff for heavy work, Eliza took over much of the ranch. She kept the house warm. She read to him on quiet evenings. He never called himself her father. He never had to. One summer morning, while cleaning the attic, she found an old tin box tucked behind cedar boards. Inside were letters. Most were from Samuel's wife. One was addressed to her. Her hands trembled as she opened it. "If you are reading this, Samuel found you." She stopped breathing. "I told him before I died that grief can turn love into a locked room. I asked him to open the door for someone someday. Someone who needs shelter more than answers. If he brought you here, then I know two things. You needed saving, and he needed saving too." Eliza sat on the attic floor with tears slipping silently down her cheeks. There was more. "You may spend years believing you were unwanted. Please don't build your life around the cruelty of wounded people. Build it around the ones who stayed. Around the ones who saw you and chose you." When she came downstairs, Samuel was on the porch. She sat beside him. "She wrote to me." He nodded. "I never knew if you'd find it. Why didn't you tell me?" "Because some truths need their own time." She leaned her head on his shoulder. "You saved me." His voice was barely above a whisper. "No, Eliza, you stayed. That's harder." He died 2 winters later, quietly in his sleep. The whole town came, not because he had been loud or important. Because goodness, when it is steady enough, becomes unforgettable. After the funeral Eliza stood in the field behind the house. Snow fell softly around her. For a long time she thought about the girl in the truck. The girl who believed she had been sold because she had no worth. She wished she could reach backward through time and hold that child's face and tell her what was coming. You are not being abandoned by your future. You are walking toward it. Eliza kept the ranch. She turned part of it into a place for girls who had nowhere safe to go. Not many at first, then more. Girls with bruised hearts. Girls with frightened eyes. Girls who believed they were burdens. She taught them to ride horses. To mend fences. To read poetry. To laugh loudly. To take up space. And every time a frightened girl stepped through her door, Eliza remembered. Sometimes the worst night of your life is only the road to the place where you finally become free. Years later, Nora, the little girl from school, returned as a teacher. "You were the first person who made me believe I could become something," she said. Eliza smiled. "No, you became something because it was already inside you." At sunset they stood together on the porch, watching light spill across the hills. And Eliza understood at last what Samuel had planned all along. He hadn't rescued her to repay grief. He had given her a future wide enough to rescue others. That was the part no one expected. Not her father. Not the town. Not even Eliza. The cruel man who sold his daughter thought he was ending her story. But he was only delivering her to the place where it would finally begin. And if you remember anything from Eliza's life, remember this: your value has never depended on the people who failed to see it. Sometimes love finds you in unlikely places. Sometimes family is chosen. Sometimes the wound becomes the doorway. And sometimes the person who thinks they are too broken, too heavy, too unwanted, becomes the reason someone else survives. If this story stayed with you, Like the video, subscribe to the channel, and tell me in the comments, what moment changed everything for Eliza.